YouTube, Awesome Rider here. Welcome to my first bonus episode for my Power Rangers Team Up Rewind series. After I get done with these handful of bonus episodes, I will finally be getting to my ranking ones. Let's start with this, with A Friend in Need, which is the Power Rangers and Masked Rider crossover. It was also technically the premiere of Season 3, although personally, in my episode count headcanon, I count Ninja Quest as that. I was going back and forth the whole time I was doing this series on whether or not I should cover this in this series. And I'm glad I did, just because it does have such a unique place in history when you think about it. Because this is one of only a small handful of things that have crossed over with Power Rangers in the show that wasn't Power Rangers related. You know, we have this and then the Turtles. And I suppose you could count like the Gavin and Skyfire stuff. I don't really, that doesn't occupy the same place in my brain just because that wasn't trying to be a Backdoor pilot, and I also don't like Metal Heroes, but regardless, this is only a small handful of things, and this is such a unique case because this was the first thing that crossed over with Power Rangers that wasn't Power Rangers itself, and technically, this happened before any other proper Ranger crossovers happened, because the first sort of proper Power Ranger crossover was the Alien Rangers Zyuranger crossover. So this is kind of interesting in and of itself. But this was meant to be a backdoor pilot for Masked Rider. They wound up not tying it as much to Power Rangers when they got to the actual series, but then this clearly wanted to set up this sort of more universe, which is something I want to talk about sort of near the end, but it's definitely interesting for that. And just for a history perspective, I mean, when I watched this when it came out, I didn't give this any thought because I didn't know about any of it, but watching this now, I'm like, God, this is weird. You have the Zyuranger 5 suits running around with the Dairanger suit from Dairanger with Black RX and Black RX footage, and that's just so weird. Not to mention the background music that Masked Rider had, which got reused for Digimon, and I just associate it with Digimon. So it's just an interesting thing to watch. And it's a 3-parter. I kept thinking it was a 2-parter, and I'm like, dang, this is going on forever. But I mean, as an MMPR episode, it's okay. As a crossover, I don't know how to rank it. I mean, I guess it was okay because it's more of a backdoor pilot than anything. Because the basic premise is like, Alpha's worried about his home originating planet, Edenoi, and he sends the Rangers there to look after what's going on, and they're basically being, you know, harassed and put into servitude by Lord, was it Draven? Draken? Devin? I can't remember his name, but the evil guy. They're being harassed by him. And the Masked Rider's there, and they immediately get into a fight over a misunderstanding. And I found this to be hilarious, because the Rangers are there, and Masked Rider immediately starts attacking him, thinking they're enemies. And they're like, look, you have to listen to us. And he's like, I have to listen to nothing. I'm like, oh my God, this guy is absolutely nailing Kamen Riders in future crossovers. That these heroes instantly start getting attacking people over misunderstandings. And I found that kind of hilarious, because it's so much of what I hate about modern day crossovers with Rider and stuff, is that they're always fighting over something that could be so simply solved, and he was just being so irrational. But I found it to be funny because it's like foreshadowing for what the superhero Tyson movies would be like. But then once they got their action sequence out of the way, you know, he comes to his senses and starts working with them. I was also slightly bugged by that they didn't recognize what a bugged, get it? Because Kamen Rider? Kind of bugged because they didn't know what a Power Ranger was. I think it's because now we're doing the comics where there's all kinds of mythology and stuff, and we've established that like the outer space people know what Power Rangers is. I don't know why I just called them the outer space people, but you know what I mean. That bothered me just a little bit, but this was early days when continuity was, what can we come up with this week? But that was basically the premise. And then once they start fighting together, the Rangers and them start fighting together against that. And back on Earth, Kimberly has to fight this repaint monster because she's the only one staying behind. And I remember when I first watched that, I thought, oh, it's because, or first rewatched it rather, I was thinking it was because Kimberly was always out because the actress was leaving, but like she was still in it. They just had a plot of her being sick and fighting on Earth by herself. I thought it was a nice moment of her stepping up to fight though, and the other Rangers couldn't. She had a couple of those. But you had that going on as well, and you had Zed having this rivalry with the Masked Rider villain. Which is kind of a play off of like the villains from the 2 crossovers fighting each other, and it was kind of cool to see them together. And it's such a weird setup, and watching it now it feels like a weird discount PR toku version of Black Panther, where it's like, oh, he's the prince and he's inheriting this mantle, but it's like, you know, that's just kind of what it reminded me of in retrospect. And it had me thinking about what could have been, especially rewatching it now from the point of view of this time, of all these cinematic universes and shared TV universes of like, what if this had worked and Masked Rider was tied more to Power Rangers and they brought VR Troopers into it and Beetleborgs into it? Like, would that have worked out? I don't know if we'd still have Rider adaptations alongside Power Rangers ones, because timeline's messy because Rider relaunched as a series with Kuga in 2000. But I don't know how, because like part of the reason, if I remember right, Beetleborgs didn't continue is because they didn't have another proper Beetle series like that looked like that to use. So I'm not sure. Again, it's hard to think about that on a meta level, but I am just curious how successful that would have been if they tied that all together. And admittedly, it would have been kind of cool. Like, say what you will about Masked Rider and some of the acting and weirdness, but the initial premise wasn't too bad. And looking back at this, I like the idea of expanding to more types of heroes in the PRU like this, and the Masked Rider mythology could have been interesting. And I like that it had very little to do with Black RX, because that's my favorite style of adaptation, is throw the source material in the trash and do your own thing. And I'm curious to see what they come up with when they're completely free of thinking about stuff that this source material did. So, you know, I'm not saying it was great, but I like the creativity of it, even though I just said it was ripped off Black Panther in a way. But you know what I mean? I like that it was different, and I think watching this more, like, the episode was overall okay, and okay as a crossover and as a backdoor pilot, but I just found it more interesting as a piece of history, both in terms of the different toku that it incorporated, and in terms of what could have been with this shared universe aspect. Especially near the end when it was so clearly setting up the Masked Rider series, and I feel like almost every character said we'll meet again someday, and then they obviously never do. And it's also especially interesting now because recently in the comics they've mentioned Edenoi again in the Power Rangers comics, and they also mentioned it previously in the Go-Go Power Rangers comics. So that's still part of the PR lore, and it's actually been a deep cut that's been used. So it's just kind of this weird missed potential thing, and an interesting place in history to revisit, even more so now where I am as a fan after having seen all this Rider stuff and knowing all the stuff I know now. So I feel like this episode was more so talking about the interesting history behind it and less about the episode, because I would just say the episode was overall okay. Kind of classic team-up stuff. They fight over a misunderstanding and then they finally join forces. It's just a weird one, but I definitely think it's worth a revisit if you were like me and you were a Power Rangers fan when you were younger. I mean, I still am, you know what I mean? You grew up with Power Rangers and then now you're into Sentai and Rider, and just revisiting it through that lens. It's interesting to rewatch just thinking about all that stuff. But what did you guys think about this episode? What do you guys think about the idea of Power Rangers having a more expansive shared universe with Masked Rider and VR Troopers and Beetleborgs, if that ever would have been a thing? Let me know in the comments as always. Until next time, like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell so you can get notifications from my videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.